first thing I saw was a pair of headlights driving straight at me like they wanted me dead. Not bright, not careless, deliberate. At 10:07 p.m., on the same empty road I had driven every night for 3 years, a car suddenly crossed into my lane and kept accelerating. For one horrifying second, I could actually see the outline of the driver's face illuminated behind the windshield, expressionless, almost smiling. Then my world exploded. Metal screamed. Glass burst across my face. My car launched off the road and slammed, nose first, into the ditch bordering the woods. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs so hard I thought my ribs had collapsed. Everything went silent except for the hiss of the engine and my own pulse hammering inside my skull. I should have died in that wreck. The front of my car was crushed like a soda can. But the worst part? The men in the other car didn't drive away. I live about 30 minutes outside the city in a quiet suburban area, and the road leading home cuts through a long stretch of woods where almost nobody drives at night. Usually, I love that silence. After dealing with endless traffic during the day, those empty roads felt peaceful. Not anymore. That night had started completely normal. I was listening to music, half awake after work, already thinking about getting home and going to sleep. I remember checking the clock and realizing I was only 10 minutes away from my neighborhood when those headlights appeared in the distance. At first, nothing seemed strange. Then the light became unbearably bright. It flooded my windshield until I had to stare at the white line on the shoulder just to stay in my lane. I remember lifting my hand to block the glare, blinking hard, trying not to panic. And then I realized the car wasn't correcting itself. It was coming directly at me. Wrong side of the road. Full speed. I jerked the wheel right without even thinking. Tires screamed across gravel before the car dropped violently into the ditch. The impact whipped my head against the window, and for a second, everything went black. When I finally stumbled out of the wreck, my legs barely worked. Steam curled from the destroyed hood. One headlight flickered weakly in the darkness. The smell of gasoline filled the cold night air. I climbed up the ditch, expecting to see taillights disappearing into the distance. Instead, the other vehicle was parked farther down the road, waiting. That's when the fear truly hit me. The woods around us were completely silent. No houses, no passing cars, no lights except theirs. I suddenly realized how alone I was. My anger disappeared instantly. I rushed back to the wreck, grabbed my phone with shaking hands, and called the police. I kept my eyes locked on the other vehicle while whispering to the operator, terrified the people inside could hear me. The dispatcher told me officers were only 5 minutes away. 5 minutes suddenly felt like an eternity. I had barely started climbing back out of the ditch when I froze. A man was standing at the top of it. I swear he wasn't there a second earlier. Tall, heavy-set, completely silent. He just stared down at me without blinking. "You almost killed me," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What the hell is wrong with you?" No response. Then the headlights behind him suddenly grew brighter. The car was moving again. Another person was driving it now. The vehicle slowly reversed toward the ditch until the rear tires stopped inches from the edge. The driver's door swung open, and a second man stepped out. Neither of them looked drunk. Neither looked scared. If anything, they looked focused. The two men began speaking rapidly in a harsh language I couldn't understand. Maybe Russian, maybe German. Their voices sounded aggressive, almost frantic. Then one of them walked to the trunk and threw it open. I expected him to grab a weapon. Instead, both men turned and looked directly at me. At the exact same time, something inside me snapped. Every instinct screamed the same thing. Run. The larger man suddenly charged downhill into the ditch while the other sprinted around my wrecked car. I turned and bolted into the woods just as I heard one of them crashing through the brush behind me. Branches tore at my face. Mud swallowed my shoes. I couldn't see anything except shadows between the trees, but adrenaline kept dragging me forward. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and angry shouting getting closer, then farther, then closer again. For one terrifying moment, I thought they were surrounding me. Eventually the sound stopped, but the silence in those woods felt even worse. I kept wandering through complete darkness, struggling to breathe, terrified that if I stopped moving, I'd suddenly feel a hand grab my shoulder from behind. Then, faintly in the distance, I heard sirens. I followed the sound until flashing red and blue lights appeared through the trees like a lifeline. When I climbed back onto the road, 2 police officers were inspecting my destroyed car. The other vehicle was gone. The men had vanished without a trace. I gave the officers everything I could remember, but there wasn't much to go on. No license plate, no clear faces, just 2 large men, a dark car, and an open trunk waiting beside the road. The police treated it like a hit and run. But I know what I saw. Those men weren't trying to escape after the crash. They were trying to finish something. And sometimes, late at night, when headlights appear behind me on empty roads, I still wonder how many other drivers never made it out of that ditch alive. I realized I was going to die in the middle of the desert when my car started choking for gas. At first, it was just a small jerk, then another. Then the engine coughed so hard the entire steering wheel vibrated beneath my hands. I looked down at the gas meter and felt my stomach drop. Empty, completely empty, and I was surrounded by nothing but darkness. I've never been good at long-distance driving. Honestly, anything over 30 minutes stresses me out. But for work, I had to make a 10-hour drive from my tiny hometown all the way to San Francisco, where our company's main office was located. I had only worked there remotely for 6 months, so this was my first time making the trip alone. And unfortunately, the route wasn't the beautiful California coastline you see in movies. It was the opposite. Endless desert highways, dead towns, empty roads that seemed to stretch forever into black nothingness. I left at 6 p.m., hoping I'd arrive close to hotel check-in the next afternoon. The first couple hours weren't bad. I drove through familiar streets, then smaller towns, then eventually absolutely nothing. No buildings, no lights. Barely any cars, just highway, the kind of silence that slowly starts making you uncomfortable. About 3 hours into the drive, I passed an old gas station and casually glanced at my fuel gauge. That's when panic hit me. I had been zoning out for so long that I completely forgot to check my gas. The needle was practically buried below empty. I cursed under my breath, but convinced myself I could make it to the next station. There had to be one nearby, right? For the next 20 minutes, I scanned desperately for exit signs. Nothing. No stations. No rest stops. No lights in the distance. Every mile made the fear worse. I could feel sweat building on the back of my neck as the engine began randomly stuttering beneath me. Small jerks at first, then violent shudders that made my heart skip every time. The desert around me looked endless, like I had driven into another planet. Then finally, through the darkness ahead, I saw headlights parked on the shoulder of the road. Relief hit me instantly. It looked exactly like a police cruiser monitoring traffic. At that point, I didn't really have a choice, so I pulled onto the shoulder, several yards behind it, and shut my car off before it died completely. I remember thinking maybe they had emergency gas canisters. Maybe I got lucky. I stepped out into the cold desert air and started walking toward the vehicle. At first glance, it absolutely looked like a police car. It had the roof light bar, spotlight near the mirror, the exact shape of a highway patrol cruiser. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The paint markings had been removed. No official logos. No numbers. It looked like an old retired police vehicle someone had bought at an auction. I slowed down. The inside of the car wasn't abandoned either. It looked clean, almost recently used. There was even a grocery bag sitting on the passenger seat filled with snacks and bottled water. But nobody was inside. That's when the fear started creeping into me. The desert around us was dead silent, except for the wind. I looked out across the dark sand and scattered cacti, trying to figure out where the driver went. Then I saw movement, far off in the darkness. Someone was out there. At first, I could only make out a silhouette moving between the cacti. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but they were crouching, digging, or dragging something across the sand. I froze. A horrible feeling settled in my chest. This wasn't normal. I immediately decided to get back to my car and call 911 or roadside assistance instead of dealing with whoever this was. But before I could move, the figure stopped, completely still. Even from that distance, I could tell they were staring directly at me. The silence became unbearable. Then suddenly, the person started sprinting toward the highway. Not walking, sprinting. I turned and ran back to my car, so fast I nearly slipped on the gravel shoulder. My hands shook violently as I yanked the driver door open and threw myself inside. By the time I locked the doors, the man had already reached the side of the road. He just stood there beside the fake police car, staring at me through my headlights. I finally got a clear look at him. Short black hair, dark beard, and dirt covering almost his entire body. His clothes, face, even his hands looked stained with sand like he had been crawling around out there for hours. What terrified me most was his expression. Nothing. No anger. No confusión. Just this cold, emotionless stare, like he was waiting to see what I would do next. I was too afraid to restart my car because if the engine failed, he'd know immediately I was stranded. So instead, I sat there in complete silence repeatedly, trying to call 911 while pretending my car worked fine. The man never moved. For nearly a full minute, he just watched me. Then finally he climbed into his vehicle. The headlights never turned on. That's the part one still think about. He drove away into the darkness with no lights at all, disappearing down the empty highway like he didn't want anyone knowing where he went. 30 minutes later, an actual police officer arrived and poured enough gas into my tank to get me moving again. I told him everything. About the fake police cruiser, the man in the desert, the way he stared at me. But the officer barely reacted. He laughed and casually joked. Maybe he was burying a body out there. Then he shrugged like it was nothing. I laughed nervously too, but deep down, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because something tells me that man wasn't stranded. And I don't think he was alone out there either. To this day, I still wonder what was hidden out in that desert, and how close I came to discovering it. My name's John. I'm 23 years old, and I work the overnight shift at a 24-hour bar in my town that's famous for cheap drinks and surprisingly good pizza. For some reason, the owners decided pizza delivery would be a great idea, even though we're literally a bar. Most nights we barely got any delivery orders, so during the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, I was usually the only driver. And after what happened that night, I seriously considered quitting. Up until that delivery, the night had been completely normal. That's what still scares me the most. Nothing felt wrong at first. No warning. No creepy feeling. No sign that I was about to walk straight into what was very likely a setup. The bar was packed that night. Loud music, drunk customers yelling over each other, glasses clinking nonstop. Honestly, I was relieved when another delivery order finally came through around 3 a.m. It gave me an excuse to get out of there for a while. I grabbed the pizza, headed to my car, and typed the address into Google Maps like I'd done 100 times before. 15-minute drive. Easy. The roads outside town were dead quiet at that hour. Streetlights became less frequent the farther I drove, and eventually the only sound were my tires rolling across the pavement and the low static of the radio. Everything felt normal, until Google Maps suddenly said, "You have arrived." I frowned immediately, because I wasn't in a neighborhood. I wasn't even near houses. I pulled over beside the curb and looked around in confusion. My headlights illuminated an old wooden sign for some kind of forest preserve or public park entrance. Beyond it was nothing but dense black woods stretching into darkness. No homes, no parked cars, no lights anywhere. I checked the address again, thinking maybe I entered it wrong. Nope, same address as the order. I remember sitting there for a second with this growing feeling in my chest that something wasn't right. Still, I figured maybe the customer accidentally pinned the wrong location or something. So I called the number on the order. The phone barely rang once before someone answered. "Hey, this is John with your pizza delivery," I said. "I think there might be an issue with the address." There was silence. Not normal silence either. I could hear the guy breathing into the phone. Slow, heavy, like he was just listening to me. Then finally he spoke. His voice was low and strangely calm. "You're in the gray sedan, right?" Every hair on my arms stood up instantly. Before I could answer, he said, "Look to your left." I slowly turned toward the woods beside the road. At first I saw absolutely nothing. Just darkness, pure black between the trees. Then suddenly, movement. A figure stepped out from behind the tree line and started waving both arms high in the air. The man was standing several yards inside the forest. Not near the road, not under the streetlight. deep enough into the trees that I could barely make out his face. I remember thinking how unbelievably strange that was. Why wouldn't he just come to the roadside? Why order a pizza to the entrance of a forest at 3 o'clock in the morning? Every instinct told me to leave, but I ignored it. I grabbed the pizza and stepped out anyway. The second I closed my car door, I noticed how unnaturally quiet everything was. No traffic, no insects, no wind through the trees. Nothing, just silence. As I crossed the empty road toward the forest, I realized something else that made my stomach tighten. The guy wasn't moving. He didn't walk toward me, didn't meet me halfway. He just stood there motionless, watching me approach. I stopped near the edge of the grass before the tree line. "Hey man," I called out awkwardly, holding up the pizza. "You could just come grab it here." The guy hesitated. Then instead of walking toward me, he slowly looked behind me, then to both sides of the road, checking for witnesses. That's when the fear finally hit me full force. My chest tightened so hard I could barely think. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have immediately turned around and sprinted back to my car. But panic froze me in place for 1 second too long. Suddenly the man rushed toward me. Fast. Way too fast. I stumbled backward in shock, nearly dropping the pizza, but before I could react, he grabbed my upper arm with both hands and violently started dragging me toward the woods. He never yelled. That's what terrified me. He stayed completely silent, using all his strength to pull me backward into the darkness between the trees. I fought hard, trying to yank free, but the guy was stronger than me. My shoes tore through the wet grass as he dragged me closer and closer to the forest. Then pure adrenaline kicked in. I started throwing punches blindly at his face. 1 hit, 2 hits, then a clean shot directly to his nose. The man finally let go, but then we were only a few feet from the trees. I turned and ran. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. Halfway to my car, I glanced back over my shoulder. The guy had recovered and sprinted back into the woods. But then 2 more men suddenly emerged from behind the trees. My blood went ice cold. They had been hiding there the entire time, waiting, watching, if he had dragged me even a little farther into those woods. I honestly don't think I would have made it back out. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped away so fast my tires screeched across the pavement. Luckily, there was a police station only a few blocks away, and I drove there without stopping once. By the time officers returned to the forest entrance, the men were gone, completely vanished. Later that night, I went back to the bar and explained everything to my boss. He checked the order information, but all they had was a disconnected phone number and a first name that was probably fake. After that, he sent me home early and gave me a free slice of pizza, like somehow that balanced everything out. But honestly, I still think about how close I came to disappearing that night. Because those men weren't trying to rob me. They chose an empty forest, a fake address, a disconnected number, no weaknesses, no cameras, no houses nearby. That wasn't random. That was planned.